I honestly believe that most sales tools today aren't really built with the individual salesperson in mind. They're rather built for the ops team or for the manager or for the sales leader. So I think this is why there's a huge problem of adoption, I think, among salespeople. And a lot of them, hate some of the tools that is being used in the day-to-day. So kind of a motto or a concept that I consistently bring back is let's bring the power back to the reps, right? Let's bring the power back to the ICs within an organization and start there.
Welcome to Change Enablers, a podcast by Tango. Sit back, relax, and listen to some of the brightest minds in operations and enablement.
All right, everyone, welcome to the Change Enablers podcast. I'm pumped about today's episode. I have an old friend here joining us, Patrick Monnot, founder and CEO of Pod. Patrick, I've had so many people sort of pitch me back my own company and do it wrong. With Tango, I've had someone be like, the company that adds squares to screenshots. And I'm like, oh God, it's so much more than that. So I'll give you a chance to talk about Pod. But a little bit more on Patrick. Before founding Pod, director of product and business operations at Zinnier, and spent a good chunk of his career at McKinsey, the global consulting firm advising tech startups. Now he's running one. So Patrick, welcome to the show. And you want to let the audience know a little bit more about Pod?
Yeah, for sure. First of all, thank you for having me. Super, super excited about the conversation. A bit about Pod in a nutshell. So we're an AI workspace for B2B salespeople. The biggest problem that we're solving is that we see a lot of salespeople losing deals because they lack the information and the guidance to know how to push deals forward. So we're ultimately trying to help them be more efficient and effective in managing their pipeline and ultimately helping them close more deals. So it's all about enablement at the end of the day. So pretty close to that topic in the world of salespeople, and excited about talking about it a bit more generally with you, Ken.
Yeah, it should be fun. I mean, there's so many angles we can go with this, but
for sure.
We'll try to keep it somewhat brief for everyone. So why don't we just jump right in? I think, in prepping for this episode, we shared a lot of our viewpoints and, agree that there's room for improvement in the world of enablement. But, maybe as you've spent so much time thinking about that space, what's one sort of sales, RevOps, enablement hill that you're willing to die on? Your hottest take? What is it?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think the one that was a bit of the genesis for Pod as well, and it's one that I truly, truly believe in, and it's at the intersection of sales ops, sales, sales tech, generally speaking, is that I honestly believe that most sales tools today aren't really built with the individual salesperson in mind, but they're rather built for the ops team or for the manager or for the sales leader. So I think this is why there's a huge problem of adoption, I think, among salespeople, and a lot of them, hate some of the tools that is being used in the day-to-day. So kind of a motto or a concept that I consistently bring back is let's bring the power back to the reps, right? Let's bring the power back to the ICs within an organization and start there. So I think it's something that definitely a hill I'll die on, and that is a bit counterintuitive to how I think a lot of software is being sold or being positioned today. Yeah,
this is almost the tension of like selling to the buyer, but then sort of forgetting the end user.
Yeah, exactly.
And, the product that the sales leader or the enablement team may be like, oh my gosh, this is going to do it. If it doesn't land with the end user, what are we doing here? So I totally hear you on that. And
nothing wrong with tools for sales leaders and ops teams and et cetera. I think you need those because everyone has to be able to work. But I think the biggest issue in my mind is portraying a tool as a tool for the individual contributor, but in reality, it's a bit more as a way for management to control the team rather than truly empower the ICs.
Yeah, I think Gong has done a really good job of bridging this gap, right? Where I think they started probably more catered to the sales leader, but over time built in the insights and functionality where a rep can say, you know what, like I'm going to self-pace my own improvement because I have all the information here that I need about the calls that I'm taking. So
agreed. That's a good example.
But it is a tough tension. When we think about sales enablement as a function, and now we could get into what companies are calling sales enablement, whether
being
it's sales
thrown around left and right a bit much these days.
rev ops, inconsistent definitions. But let's just use sales enablement for now. Like, what would you assess as kind of the state of sales enablement today?
I think that sales enablement today, and I don't want to make a generalization, but generally speaking, it is centered around the concept of programmatic structured enablement, right? So whether it is documentation or having a learning journey or onboarding, having courses every couple of weeks to get your team, quote unquote, up to date. I think it is very structured around those one and done type of exercise around learning and enablement. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, right? Don't get me wrong. I think it's about, complementing, and I think I want to touch about this a bit later on, but I think it's more about complementing the enablement journey between programmatic and then real-time enablement. And I think it's not either or. It's not let's kill programmatic for the benefit of real-time enablement, but after that 1 week onboarding session of a salesperson when they jump a company, or 1 week or a month, right? Enablement shouldn't stop. Right. It should be something that is built in and embedded into their day-to-day work. So I think today it's very structured, very programmatic. I think that's logical. It's a way for, ops team and enablement team to roll out something that makes sense. But when you actually look at whether or not it's working, I think it misses the mark in many cases, right? I'll share an example, right? Early on when I was thinking about Pod, right? Thinking about the problem, I had some exposure to it. I was talking to a former colleague of mine who was an account executive, and I told him, like, hey, how do you think about enablement, right? How do you think about onboarding? You have the information that you need. And what that person told me really stuck with me. They said, I know that there exists a lot of cool case studies and documentation and, learning courses that, my manager and my sales ops team asked me to read through. But in the day-to-day, out of sight is out of mind. So I think that's something that really stuck with me because, I think the human has the normal tendency to, build a habit over 21 days or something like that. So out of the 100% of the content that is shared during the onboarding, maybe what will really stick to the person is 20% of it at most. So it's about how do you always reinforce it. So I don't know. I think there's something interesting with what's currently in place, but I think we're not 100% there in terms of ultimately being able to help people.
Yeah, I think out of sight, out of mind is absolutely, and that's exacerbated by, we had a previous guest come on who's like, yeah, everything we document and everything we tell our teams that they should learn, we just kind of throw it in a bucket. It's up to everybody else to kind of sift through the bucket and figure out what's relevant. You talked about something in an article I read similar to this, which was like the tab apocalypse, which I freaking love that term. What for the audience, what's the tab apocalypse and how does it play into kind of what you're saying with like out of sight, out of mind, and almost like the overwhelming nature of everything that a team has to access?
I think the key word here is overwhelming, right? I think tab apocalypse is the concept that knowledge workers are overwhelmed with using too many applications, right? Tab apocalypse is that the interesting analogy is that we probably all know a colleague that has 50 or 75 tabs open on their browser at any given point. They know their way around. At least that's what they say. Exactly. But I think what's kind of interesting is that it leads to a lot of inefficiencies, lack of productivity, overwhelming, a lot of cognitive overload, so to speak. There was an interesting study on that matter from HBR, Harvard Business Review. I think they surveyed 150 different workers. And I think they realized over time that on an average, on a given day, a person would switch tabs or toggle between tabs 1,200 times, which added up over a week to like 4 hours of just toggling, context switching, right? Which is crazy. When you think about it, that's 10% of your week actually doing nothing good. So I think what it comes down to enablement is, I think there's a lot from an enablement perspective. I think it comes down to having the information that you need to be productive when and where it's most helpful. And by having all these different tools, right? And it's a big problem in sales right now, right? The tech stack on a given week is 15 to 20 different tools they have to navigate between. In addition to create a lot of like unnecessary admin work, I think a lot of salespeople and digital workers, generally speaking, ask themselves consistently, where is that information? What is the latest information? How can I actually use it? And just thinking through it rather than having that information to some extent delivered on a kind of a silver plate for you in the moment where you need that help. I think that's where Tab Apocalypse has, it's funny when you think about it, when you think about the tabs and it's like how that person is kind of organized but disorganized, but it has ripple down effect people's ability to leverage helpful information to make smart choices, or if anything, just be more productive.
Yeah, I'm going to share something embarrassing because I literally started counting my own tabs. I went to a tab. This is my Tab Apocalypse.
Yeah.
I went to a tab where I was like, I actually don't even recognize what that is. I opened it up and it was an article that was what to expect in SaaS selling in Q4 of 2023. Guess what's not relevant?
Slightly outdated.
Guess what's not relevant anymore? Yeah. So but I think that's interesting because like, what was my behavior there? I probably was like, oh, that's interesting. I'll come back to it.
Yeah.
Let me open it up. I didn't come back to it until you reminded me of the Tab Apocalypse. And so, I'm sure a ton of people can empathize with that, where it's like this virtue of like, yes, I will read that. I will apply that. Let me park it away in a tab. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I missed that for actually a full quarter.
Exactly. To the point where it's actually irrelevant at this point because we're past before.
Yeah.
But I think, you can do the same type of analogy between the tabs and applications as well. I think there's this growing discussion about like the tech stack, the Franken stack, so to speak, like bolting a bunch of different tools to your tech stack. And I think that at the end of the day, hurts more than it helps at scale for an organization.
Absolutely. And so let's go back a little bit. You talked about kind of this programmatic nature of enablement. When I think about that, sometimes I think about, these enablement teams kind of measuring their progress and impact on number of sessions, number of new, modules, number of new artifacts, so it's volume based, right? And it's not actually, sometimes it's not perfectly tied to what they're trying to drive at the business. And so maybe sort of reframed like, as a result of this over indexing on programmatic enablement, where do you see enterprise sales teams missing the mark as a result?
That's a good question. I think it's a good question. I think a concept that that is too often overlooked. And having a lot of conversation with sales leaders, the first thing that they talk about is always about quantity or like efficiency, right? I don't want my team to spend as much time on updating their Salesforce, or I don't want to them spend time, duplicating data entry across different platforms. But I think that the balance between quantity and quality, and in this case, it's, the amount of time that you can spend doing quality work versus the quality of the decision, so to speak, is too often. So the quality part, so to speak, is too often overlooked, where at the end of the day, you could have the best sales process and the best tools in the world where you're reduced by, 5 to 10 hours every single week, the amount of admin work, low value work that you have to do as a salesperson. If the salesperson takes those extra 5 to 10 hours and uses it either not to work, which is an example, but also to do the wrong things, like you're not actually helping the organization or driving business results, right? So I think where they missed the mark is too much focus on quantity, not enough focus on quality of decision making, quality of the processes, and so on and so forth. So I think it goes back to the point about learning, and when you think about enablement and programmatic, I think there's a bit too much focus on these workshops every few weeks and creating the documentation about industries and your product and sales methodology, and not enough focus about how do you continuously enable users in the day-to-day, not just once in a while. Because when you take the time to talk to salespeople, well, they have a bunch of problems that programmatic enablement doesn't solve.
Totally. I mean, this reminds me a lot of what we talk about at Tango, where, when people are valuing their tools, their tech stack, what they're looking at a lot of times is logins, views, like these metrics that don't have a quality counterbalance. We talk a lot about, no, you want to measure like process adoption. Like, are you driving the processes that you need in those tools? Not, is someone logging in and are they getting lost? Okay, we'll call
it
that
is an indicator. Don't get me
spend.
wrong, right? You have to understand if people are actually adhering to the process, etc. But only basing it on that specifically misses, to your point, misses the mark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned 5 to 10 hours, and I'm sort of curious. When you think about the amount of time that people are spending not selling, that admin work load, what does that look like today, the split between selling and admin?
Yeah.
And then in your ideal world, like, what does that split eventually look like?
Good question. I think I'll share a statistic, something I read recently in the latest state of sales report by Salesforce. They put that every year. The percentage of a sales rep's day-to-day work spent on non-selling activity was 72%. That number is crazy. And then that number in and of itself is shocking, to say the least.
Wow.
But the fact that it's actually been increasing over the past 5 years, if you look at the state of sales report, I think 5 years ago or so, it was at 64%. So it's getting worse and worse. But I think diving into like, what do they actually spend their time on, and what is that 72% spent on, so to speak? I think that's where it's interesting. It's not like if you were going to take that time and ultimately delete it through automation. I'm not a big believer in like replacing.
You're not getting to zero.
Exactly, ever. But I think some of these activities are things like doing research on your accounts or contacts ahead of a meeting, right? Prepping and planning an upcoming demo or an upcoming qualification call, prioritizing your deal. I think I hear often from salespeople the concept of the Monday morning syndrome, which had a great weekend, 8 a.m. on a Monday, you get in front of your pipeline and you're like, what do I do now? I have 30, 40 deals in my pipeline. Where do I spend my time? Right? So prioritizing is another part of it. There's obviously the traditional manual work or admin work, which is manual data entry, admin work, then navigating the organization for approval. I think that there's clearly an opportunity in my mind to reduce that number by 50%. Right. So if we could get to, rather than be 75% of their day, 75% of their day or their week, it could be 30, 40%. I think first of all, I think that's definitely possible. Right. It's not crazy, considering that a lot of the processes or the approach to salespeople today are a bit antiquated, or a bit manual, or a bit, they're kind of peppered with, tab apocalypse and scattered fragmented information. But I think that's
manual data entry.
Exactly. I think we can definitely get it to 30% of their day. And just the sheer impact of that, of thinking about, rather than spending out of 40-hour weeks, spending 25 hours on admin work, you can spend, 5 to 10 hours on admin work, and the rest is on selling. That has, first of all, that has ripple down effect both for the individual contributor, right? I think no one likes admin work, right? The sellers sell because they like selling, right? They like the human context. They can do more of that. And that leads, obviously, from a business perspective to, you can manage more deals, or you can close deals faster, or you minimize the amount of you minimize the amount of balls you drop on deals. So I think that has like positive impact, both from a cultural and emotional, but also a business aspect for business angle for the business.
Just momentum too, in general, right? It's like you're slowing yourself down for those 72%. I can't get over that. 72% of hours that you're spending in admin work. So, for RevOps teams, enablement teams, what role should they be playing in fixing this problem, right? If I'm a RevOps team and I'm looking at that state of sales report, I'm saying, whoa, 72% in admin, like I gotta do something about that. Like what do you see as those teams' role?
Let me start by saying I don't think there's a silver bullet, right? It is, what's very interesting about enablement, generally speaking, is it's not a binary type of high-tech solution where it either works or it doesn't work. There's an inherent human aspect to it. So it's all about how people adopt new technology, change their approach, learn, et cetera, et cetera. So I think for me, the way when I have conversation with RevOps team or RevOps leader or ops leader or sales leader, whoever that might be, that have an impact on processes, tech tools, et cetera, is I think the first step is always taking a step back and understanding what your team actually needs to be successful. I think it starts
Yep.
and it has to end there, right? It's understanding the information that they need. There are gaps in knowledge, where does a sales funnel typically gets, where do deals get stuck throughout the sales funnel? I think it's all these well, I can repeat that question. So I think it comes down to the fact that from a RevOps perspective, it has to start and end with the fact that you need to understand what your team needs to be successful, right? Whether it's the information they need, the knowledge gaps, understanding where sales deals get stuck throughout the funnel. I think understanding that is the first thing, right? Not making assumption, actually talking to your salespeople, understanding what they experience on the field, what are their frustration, right? And I think that's number one. Then you can design the process and the tool and the tech stack you need in order to support it, not the other way around. I think too often, and not just in sales, I think that's a problem around technology, generally speaking. You start with the tech and you try to look for the problem, right? And then that leads to, like I mentioned earlier, like Frankenstack. It's like, oh, this is a great tool. Maybe it'll be useful. Let me throw it on my sales team and see if they adopt it. And they don't. But I think if you flip it around, think about the problem that they have and what are the tools that you need to fill in the gaps. I think that's where you can get to much simpler tech stack, a much simpler process, but also a lot more adoption, right? And I think that's something that I'm very, very sensitive to, so to speak, is you probably read that book, Start With Why, right? I think people are inherently driven by the why in everything, not necessarily the how at first. Okay. And I think a big problem with digital adoption, I think that's something that you guys do great, is, understanding why am I changing my process? Why am I adopting this new tool? How is it helping me, before understanding how to use it, right? And people too often kind of flip that around, and people are like, hey, this is a great tool. Yes, it's sexy, but sexy is cool. It's, sounds nice, great UI, but why would I use this, right? How does it fit into my day-to-day work? Why is it not, is it a net positive versus a net negative? So I think that's kind of...
And that's some of that detachment you see from the buyer to the end user, right? We have this concept we talk about a lot, and I'm curious to get your take on where you feel like I have a suspicion, but where you feel like sales teams fall on the spectrum. But we have this concept called ambivalent adopters, and it is a generalization, but it's sort of just acknowledging that a lot of times, especially when it comes to software, the end users are exactly like what you said. They're kind of questioning, okay, why do I need another tool? Like, how much time am I actually going to put into this? So it's so critical to just be like, hey, you know what? These people that want to execute really well at their job, want to keep doing what they're good at, are still ambivalent adopters. And you should go into it with that mindset, and make things just dead simple. Like, that's something we embrace. I'm curious where you think sales teams kind of fall. Like, are they?
Let me flip it around. What is your hypothesis? I feel like you're leading with this by, do you think that they're on the worst side of the offenders, or on the good adopters? I think there's that preconception.
Yeah, I think they're the worst. I think they're the worst, right? Or maybe not even the worst. I think maybe they embrace, because I don't want to make ambivalent adoption seem like it's a negative thing. It's really just like people that want to get their job done. Yeah. And they want to do it, but if you keep throwing curveballs at them, hey, here's this new process, here's this new thing, here's this new, pathway, like that gets really frustrating. And so I think in the ambivalent adopter world, I tend to think of sales teams, because like you said, I do this for selling. I want to keep selling. I want to keep the momentum. Yeah. But I'm curious to hear your take on that.
So I think tactically, I agree with you. I don't necessarily see them as being the worst offenders in a negative way, to your point, but I think you have to understand the persona first and foremost, right? There's this quote that, life is all about incentives. And I think salespeople within an organization have a unique incentive structure that no other function have, right? You have to put yourself in the shoes of a salesperson, right? 50% of their compensation is driven by their performance, right? It's a compensation structure that is significantly different from anything else. Imagine if you're an HR person and that 50% of your comp is driven by the quality of the hires or whether they stick around. If you're a financial analyst, so to speak, 50% of your compensation is driven by the accuracy of your forecast, right? These concepts feel crazy when you think about it. But for a salesperson, it's obvious. Like, if you don't bring in business, you don't get paid, right? So I think there's the reason why I'm sharing that is I think there's an inherent skepticism or inertia to change for salespeople because of how much it can have an impact on, I don't want to say their livelihood, but if anything, their compensation, right? Their financial health or their wage, right? So I think what it means for salespeople, it is that they have to really understand, going back to my initial point, really need to understand how it's actually helping them to reach their goal. And I think in sales, you boil it down to one thing: closing more deals. So they really need to understand, how is this helping me to close more deal, right? And I think that it's actually a thought process that more function and companies should actually adopt, because it would kind of shave off a lot of waste across the board if you actually, for every decision that you take in terms of process or tools, like, hey, is this actually moving the needle in the right direction? Is it actually, going back to my point, net positive or net negative? So I think that that's why salespeople, so to speak, are ambivalent adopters, because they have a very critical eye to adopting or change altogether. They ultimately change, right? Salespeople are entrepreneurial in nature, so they're always looking to find new ways, but there's a burden of proof from whatever new process or technology on, is it actually having impact?
Right. And look what we're doing to them. 72% of their time increasing on admin work. So yeah, I mean, basically what you're saying is that 50% of compensation now needs to be achieved in less selling time, right? And so I get the skepticism. I understand the ambivalence. And that's where I think we need to think more deeply about real-time enablement. Yeah. And so I want to transition a little bit to real-time enablement, a term that you have sort of coined and used a ton. Talk to us. What is real-time enablement? Well, to save the audience from hearing real-time enablement 1,000 times. We'll refer to it as RTE. After this.
There you go. But I like it. Another acronym.
What is RTE?
Yeah, I think it's the concept of bringing bite-sized contextual support or guidance to sellers or knowledge workers throughout their day-to-day work. Right. For me, it was like I mentioned a bit earlier, it was born from the fact that I heard a lot of salespeople say, out of sight, out of mind. And I think that highlighted the need for enablement that was more, I'd say, intricately embedded into their workflows, right? Again, not to do the comparison with programmatic enablement. It's, for 90% of my day, I'm not looking at these documents while I'm preparing for a meeting or whatnot. How can I get these bite-sized pieces of information or, some knowledge nuggets, whatever that might be, when and where I need it most? Right? It could be before a meeting, after a meeting, when you're trying a new tool, whatever that might be. That's the interesting thing about RTE, is that it can be anywhere and nowhere at the same time, but it's about identifying these points. So bite-sized contextual support and guidance to the individual contributors.
This is a movement, I would say, where we start with the programmatic. We see a lot of teams that are embracing kind of the programmatic style of enablement and training. This is a movement. Who should care most about this movement? Who should be paying attention to what's happening in real-time enablement? Is it reps, managers, RevOps teams, leaders, everybody?
I'll answer the question, and I'm curious, because I have a very sales-centric perspective on it. I'm curious for the rest of the organization where it falls, and hear what you've seen and what you've heard from other organization leader. But I think for me, it might be very, very cheesy of an answer, but it involves everyone, right? In different ways, obviously. So I think on one end, you need the managers to take a hard look at their sales process or sales methodology and understand how they'd actually need to support reps, right? Most of them are former salespeople. So you need them to do the work up front. Then you need RevOps to be able to build the relevant content or build the right stack, right? In order to support salespeople. But at the end of the day, like I mentioned, I'll say again and again, it starts and ends with salespeople, right? We all do this in order to support the individual contributors, and they're the ones who are running the deals. They're the ones that are, in front of the clients. They're the ones that need the most help. So going back to the hill I'm going to die on, it's, bringing the power back to the reps. They're the front line, and everything is structured around, RT is ultimately structured around them, but it involves other stakeholders and support. And I think sales is a bit unique where they have a dedicated ops function. But going back to my initial point, for the rest of the companies, what does that look like? Is it HR? Is it ops? Is it IT? Is it a mixed bag of everything? I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate your answer. I'm going to take a slightly different spin, but I think in the most forward-thinking organizations that we've worked with, the training, L&D, whatever you want to call it, that sort of functional role, I won't even call it like a title. I'll just say like that role and responsibility is getting closer and closer to the teams. I think sales has done this relatively well with, embracing RevOps, embracing sales enablement, bringing training much, much closer to the reps. But for me, like if you are that forward-thinking organization, you're thinking more about how can we cultivate an environment of continuous growth and learning that just lives within our team, and it isn't necessarily outsourced
to like a satellite function. Interesting. So it's not like a group that applies L&D programs across the board, but ultimately branched off into, I don't know, the finance team, the marketing team in terms of what they actually need. Is that?
And maybe on the same token, like those L&D teams should be kind of like looking in the rearview mirror and thinking like, oh, like what's coming for the way that we have traditionally done work? Because, I do hear just so often teams pointing to like, oh, here's our LMS, here's all our modules, here are the trainings people have to complete, here's the success in completing that. And I think holding on to a lot of those things as the way we've done it, the way we're going to continue to do it, and not to your point, taking a step back and being like, well, okay, let's start with why. What do the end users of this actually need? And I think another concept of real-time enablement that you touched on is like, a lot of this stuff is going to have to be very personal. That's where AI comes into play too. And we have so much insight into how people are working across an organization, what might be the best practice or best pathway. I already talked about Gong. Like Gong's been doing that for the audio file for years, but we're going to be able to soon do that for the log file of all the software that you're using, all the actions that you're taking. And so that's getting closer and closer to those teams actually doing the work.
That's interesting. Like boiling it down, not just on what does the team behavior look like, but on an individual basis. Like what is that person's habit? What are they not opening this type of software and they should? Yeah. That's actually, that's where it has to go, right? You start with kind of the peanut butter spread approach, and then you make it a bit more personal to every function, and then you have to make it personal to every individual. That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. That's going to be super powerful. And it kind of leads me to my next question too. Like organizations that embrace RTE, how does that sort of spark empathy for sales reps or really any end user?
I don't think that I think to some extent it might spark empathy in a specific way, going back to your point, which is it pushes people to take a step back and better understanding the needs and the struggles of their team members, right? I think that's one form of empathy where, again, you don't think about the technology first, you think about the problem. So that pushes you to talk to people, grab a coffee, understand their worries, that foreign concept of, face-to-face conversation. Yeah. So I think that's one thing. I think beyond that, in the context of salespeople specifically, I think it creates a more humane approach to sales enablement, which isn't as much structured around, unidirectional sharing of information, but rather collaboration, right? Knowledge sharing, best practice sharing. In sales, it's a very nuanced function, right? As much as you can think that there's theory and playbooks, the reality is oftentimes different. So I think real-time enablement doesn't have to come in as, a knowledge nugget or objection handling card. It could actually be just providing a platform for people to share what they've learned from a previous deal and how it could be helpful to others, or sharing best practices, or et cetera. So I think about empathy more in that way of like, let people who are thinking about, their sales work day in, day out, share and learn from one another. And I think that's where there's a lot of power, but it stems from the fact that you have to first push people to better understand what are the needs. If you don't do that, then it's a non-starter.
Yeah. And getting over the hurdle of, sales team members kind of sharing their best practices. I mean, that's also a behavioral change in and of itself for some sales organizations where what I do, what my recipe for success is tightly held.
I don't want to share it.
Like, yeah.
Well, I think another blunt perspective on this. I think that's stupid. And I think it's dumb, a dumb approach. I think it's an old approach as well. I think more and more organizations are leaning more and more around sharing. I think going back to my point, I think it comes down to incentives, right? A lot of sales leaders are creating these environments where if you're not performing on this deal, I will take it and move it over to your colleague and he's going to make, the money, right? And when you start talking about money, people get a bit more sensitive, so to speak. But I think that more and more organizations are moving towards, hey, you have your territory, you have your accounts, right? That other AE is working on other territories. So how does it work on your end? How does it work in the Northwest? I'm working on the Southeast territory. Like, anything you can share? Was the presentation that you used for that company in the telecom space? I have another meeting coming up. I think that's just, the competitive environment, I think is shifting more and more. You still have many organizations doing that. And that's quite honestly a bit of a boomer mentality, to say the least.
I want to get a little tactical.
Yeah.
So, real-time enablement, I think for folks that are listening can kind of feel a little, let's call it like pie in the sky, ideal case, pipe dream, two founders chatting, talking about the future, right? But maybe like, what does it look like in practice? Let's take an example for a sales rep on an average day. Like, what does real-time enablement look like in that moment in your view?
Yeah, I'll do the good old day in the life of an AE. And I think what's interesting about RT is that it's, again, embedded into micro actions left and right, and it will take a number of different shapes. So it's not, again, one big thing, one big use case. It's 100 different use cases. So the way I like to think about it is, well, let's go back to the Monday morning, 8 a.m., right? You're an AE. RT is basically helping AEs to better prioritize which deal require their attention for that given day for a number of different reasons. It's about highlighting maybe urgent tasks that they have to tackle that day. It is for deals that are stuck that you highlight, what are potential actions that you should take or playbooks that you should apply in order to unblock that deal. Let's say further in the day, you have a meeting with a prospect, right? Ahead of the call, synthesizing research information about a contact or a company in order to, if anything, have a great conversation starter, if not be able to tailor your messaging and your approach to the prospect. After the call, automatically identifying next steps, or, there's all these kind of small things that can fit in throughout their day-to-day task. And I think it could also be, if you think of it more in a disruptive way, it could, and that's something that we're doing at Pod, is maybe creating a conversational interface, not a chatbot, but a sidekick, right? Create a sidekick for the salesperson where they can ask questions about best practice, about, query their data, or question their data, their pipeline, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's what enablement looks like. It's a number of different shape and form, and it's not just AI. Sometimes it's just bringing the information when and where they need it.
Yeah, I think that's great. And it's similar to the way we think about it too, where, how do you sort of remove that, shoulder tap, or remove that question where you're like, I don't even necessarily know what I'm looking for, but I'm going to guess at what this article might be called, or I'm going to guess who's the subject matter expert, and, maybe I'm interrupting them. So, I think we share a similar view, but to avoid making this podcast sound like, we're selling Tango and Pod here, maybe let's talk about what some of our audience can do. Let's say they don't have the budget for a tool, and they don't want to make a purchase like Pod or Tango. That's fine. You can still listen.
It's okay. But everyone's welcome. It's all love.
Everyone's welcome. What can those people start doing today to head down this movement, this path of real-time enablement?
I think it comes down to, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, two things. And I'll start with the latter, which I think is simplify. Right? It's not always about adding new stuff to your process. It's not always about bring in that new cool tech. Sometimes it's about looking at what you have and realizing that, oh, no one's using A, B, C, and D software, or it's not behaving in the way that's actually helpful. So I think simplifying, it's actually, you should actually save money out of this, not actually spend more money. That's number one. But again, I think it comes down to the fact that you need to do the work up front of understanding what good looks like, what is actually helpful versus unhelpful. And then you can look at your tech stack. I think this is kind of an easy first step, right? At times it can get political in different organizations, right? Some people brought in a given tool and they don't want to let it go. But the more that we can have a transparent, open conversation across all different stakeholders, right? You bring in IT, you bring in ops, bring in HR, you bring in, I don't know, business operations, whatever that might be. You bring it all together, you highlight a problem. If people disagree, then I think that's a bigger problem, so to speak. But once you agree that there's a problem, that's the first step afterwards to finding the solution. And I think first step for me is simplify before adding anything else. In sales tech, there's that concept of consolidation, right? Why have 20 different tools and 5 of them have overlapping functionalities? Why don't you find a tool that can do multiple things, right? I think that's not to promote Pod here for any reason, but we're thinking about ourselves as a workspace first and foremost, right? You don't have to jump between Google Docs, Trello, your Salesforce, etc. You have a system of action, a place where you can get your work done that basically allows you as a user to not have to go to these 5-10 other different tools. So simplify is the name of the game to start with.
Simplify. Love it. I'd say something similar. We talk about this concept within documentation of minimum viable context.
Oh, interesting. Never heard that.
Fancy way to say simplify. But, I think you were talking about it from the perspective of like, you're probably overloaded with tools. Like, you can consolidate. I think for us, when you talk about those knowledge nuggets, when you talk about those things that people are going to employ into their process and follow along, we did a survey where we basically said, like, what do you hate today about existing documentation? Or what's the reason why you either can't trust it or you can't use it? And top 2 responses, too much information, not enough information. And so, it was a little bit, for a second, it was a little bit like, well, what do we do with that?
Yeah, well, how do you take action on this?
Yeah, but we actually thought about it more deeply, and we were like, okay, so there's probably like a Goldilocks zone where it's like people are given the information that they need in their moment of need, to your point, but it's not overwhelming. It's not requiring a wall of text to be sifted through. It's what is the minimum amount of information I need to be successful? I think that is a key pillar of real-time enablement. And then similar to your point around tooling, consolidation is one aspect, but if you're adding more tools, like make sure the integrations are there.
That's a good point.
Make sure that like the new tool that you add is kind of meeting people where they already are. Yeah. If they already have the knowledge base, make sure it integrates with the knowledge base, and and just try to not give people the tab apocalypse, like meet people where they already are. So those would be my 2 pieces of advice.
I like the minimal viable content. I think especially with content, the Pareto laws, the 80-20 type of law is definitely applicable, right? Out of 100 different articles that you have or how-to guides, etc., there's probably like 20 of them that people are actually using and that make a difference.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that actually probably leads to the fact that there's too much information and not enough information. I think there's too much information in an absolute basis, but they don't have access to the information they need easily. So they feel like they don't have the information that they need. Interesting. I love that. I think that's definitely, it's not just applicable to digital adoption, but to generally speaking, to how people think about their workflows and the tools that they need, the information they need, and so on. That's awesome.
Yeah. And somewhere along the way, we convinced ourselves that being more comprehensive, being more exhaustive, being more thorough was going to be the best way to write anything down. Admittedly, like I'm kind of coming back on that, but, awesome. Well, I think that is going to be super helpful to everyone listening, thinking about RTE. Appreciate that perspective, Patrick. I want to wrap up with a couple closers. Things that maybe we didn't touch on that I just selfishly want to touch on.
Yeah.
So, with Pod, you talk a lot about, AI, you're the sort of the AI sidekick for sales teams. Obviously, what's been at the top of the news for a while is what's been going on with OpenAI, a very short little chapter around what's going on with Sam Altman. But this space and this industry, not even to specifically point out OpenAI, there's a lot that's changing and moving
very quickly.
In your view, as a company that's in the middle of that, what are the implications for your end customers? What should people be thinking about with the future of AI? And are there any just general sort of watch outs or ground rules that you're sharing with customers?
I think it's a complicated question to answer. I won't comment on the OpenAI situation, obviously. I think a lot of people have talked about it already. There's a few concepts to me that are important with AI that, in terms of how we build product, from that perspective, are important, but it translates to how people adopt AI, either through a tool like Pod or Tango or elsewhere or internally, right? I think the one thing that is most important for me to articulate, I think, is that AI is not new. It is not new, right? It is evolving. It is more accessible. Yes, it is more powerful. But I'm originally from Montreal, Canada, which is a hotbed for deep learning, right? You have the founding fathers of deep learning. 3 out of the 4 are based in Canada, something like that. Don't quote me on it. But I think it's not new. People have been working on this for 25 years. I think now it hits the public, so it looks like it's grandiose and new, et cetera. I think it's definitely exciting, and it's moving quickly, and it'll enable way more use cases and way to leverage it. But it's not new, right? At the end of the day, AI is a technology. It is a tool, a means to an end, right? So it's not necessarily about tackling, seeing that shiny object and try to figure out where to apply it, but starting with a true pain point and leveraging AI to solve it, right? I think the companies who are going to thrive through AI are the ones that were solving an acute pain point before AI, and now they're just solving it better with AI. I think the ones that are actually going to fail, and I think there was at some point, someone saying, VZ saying that 90% plus of AI startups built in 2023 are going to die, right? And I kind of agree with it, because a lot of them were just starting with the technology and like finding a problem to solve, and even if it wasn't an important one or whatnot. So I think from that perspective, that concept, generally speaking, I think, first of all, reduces a bit of the how scary AI is, right? AI is whatever people want it to be. It could be rule-based logic, it could be fancy model, it could be generative AI model, but it's a tool, right? You have the power to use it. You have to think through how to use it best. So I think that's how we think about it. It's, and we're not positioning Pod as like a crazy, fancy co-pilot that is, not relatable. It's just a sidekick, like you mentioned. So I think people should actually take that same approach to how they adopt AI within their company. It's not a groundbreaking change for the company. Is, okay, what are the small improvements that we can do here and there? And I think that de-emphasizes or de-escalates the scare around AI and its adoption.
I think it's a really great reminder. We've met with so many AI task forces within companies. And it is this phenomenon that you've mentioned where it's a hammer trying to find a nail, where the mandate is just, we need to go find AI tools. But they don't take an inventory of like, okay, well, what do we need to go find AI tools to do? So I think that's a great reminder. And then the last question for you, this one should be a layup. Who's someone you follow that makes you better at your job?
You can. I'm messing with you. I agree. So I think
too embarrassing. We can't go with that.
Cut this part. Let's reshoot.
No, we can keep it.
No, but I think seriously, it would be too easy to point out one specific individual that has had great success and point that as inspiration. You and I are both founders. To me, that not the one individual, but the group of people I love following is just fellow entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs, like people who are excited about startups, who operate startup, who are thinking about taking the leap, who are launching their startup or struggling or succeeding, I guess, to build it. I think being a founder is a bit of a unique experience. No one prepares you to that. There's no school for it. So surrounding yourself with other founders, like yourself, like some of my friends, is the best way to learn, to improve, to stay motivated. It can be a lonely road at times, but
So valuable.
I think that's the most important thing to stay hyped, to stay motivated, and ultimately build great things.
Absolutely. Well, not to mention not beating your head against the wall when you're like, okay, I need to file a new business registration in this random state. What did I mean, there's so many things, that we all encounter that go under the radar and, don't make the headlines. But Patrick, it's great to catch up, man. Thank you for joining. I think folks are going to love this conversation on real-time enablement. So, I'll throw it back at you. If you're listening, give Patrick a follow.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I love talking about this. I could go on and on and on, but excited to see other companies thinking about RT, and ultimately we're both pushing in the same direction to make life better for folks out there. So thank you so much for the chat, man.
Let's do it.